think I have everything ready here. Hello to everyone joining on Facebook from everywhere. It's great to see everybody tonight. I think the intriguing title of tonight's episode may have attracted a few additional people. Always a good topic, Governor Cornbury, and whether he did or did not actually wear women's clothes. So we'll be talking about that tonight. And let's see what else. I think that's it. So let's wait a couple more minutes and see who's here. Hello to Pennsylvania. Thank you for thinking I look pretty. Thank you so much, Indiana. Everyone can hear me. Excellent. So tonight's subject is the early, Governor of New York, Governor Lord Cornbury. And his name was also Edward Hyde, or the third Earl of Clarendon, Viscount Cornbury. And he was the governor of our fair colony from 1701 through 1708. And of course, that is long before I was born or before even my parents were born. And so I know that many people say, well, Mrs. Q, why do we have to talk about things that happened so long ago and people that have long, died and disappeared from view? Well, I say, if we don't look at what we've done before, and if we don't look at what we've done with our culture and with our society and with our government in the past, well, how indeed will we ever know how to make better choices going forward? So to do that, we're going to look back in time at the time of Cornbury and see what was happening, and maybe whether or not any of those things, have happened again, or maybe it will serve as a warning for us for the future, or a guide to behave a little bit better, or at least to choose our leaders a little bit better. Oh, hello to Miami. Thank you for joining tonight. So in order to understand the full story of Governor Cornbury, we do have to go back even further to the late 1600s or 17th century. And I know in your time, people have a great deal of reluctance of going back and talking about these royal families, rules of succession, aristocrats, and all of these sorts of things. And even today, people would say to me, Mrs. Q, why didn't we fight a war against England to rid ourselves of such things, of hereditary power and royal families and rules of succession? And indeed we did, but we still had them, and they still did play an important role. And I think we also need to understand that there are other ways of acquiring an aristocracy through ways that maybe aren't inheriting land or property or titles, that there are other ways a ruling aristocracy can come into existence and oppress the people of a nation. So we should always be on the lookout for those kinds of trends and be sure, we don't let them occur again. So we go back a little bit. Let's see, I just want to see. So we're going to go back and we're going to talk about something called the Glorious Revolution. And I do not know if this is something you still study in class or not. And the Glorious Revolution was an event that took place in Britain in the late 1600s. The exact year it concluded was 1689. And it was at that time that King James II, who you might remember was actually the first governor of New York when the English took New York from the Dutch in 1664, before he was king, and he was just the king's brother James, the Duke of York, thus our name today for him. Well, that James eventually became king himself, King James II. And there was quite a bit of concern as King James was Catholic. And there was great fear of a Catholic succession to the crown. And again, I know in your time and even in my time, these ideas of religious oppression and fear of different religions are not so intense as they were at that time. Now, remember, in the 1600s, many of the people who fled here to the American colonies fled because of religious oppression. Thank you, Miss Ackerman. I enjoy having you here as well. So I'm getting some compliments from the Facebook side. So excuse me, I'm just taking a bit of a diversion to thank people for thanking and complimenting me. So we have this issue of religious persecution, primarily in Europe, or something then called the Holy Roman Empire. So here in the American colonies, we find many people who fled the oppression of the Roman Catholic Church. And we also found some people here who were Presbyterians fleeing the oppression of the Anglican Church of England, as well as other types of religious oppression that was occurring at the time. We also had here in New York, of course, Jews and French Huguenots and Quakers and an array of different religious observances. In England, though, there was great concern that James, being a Catholic, would lead to a Catholic succession to the crown. And that led to some people thinking that they needed to replace him or have a successor that they could ensure would be Protestant. And they looked to his daughter, Mary, who was married to William of Orange, or William III, who was a Protestant, and he was also a Dutchman. And a deal was made that James II would leave England and his daughter and son-in-law, William III, would ascend to the crown and they would rule over England. So now when that happened, there was some other discussion that went on, and that was about whether or not William truly was the king and ought to rule in his own right, or whether he really was just the consort of Mary, who was the true heir to the throne, and that she ought to reign as queen. And I'll just add here that Mary had a younger sister named Anne, and Anne will be entering our story as we proceed. Now, in the meantime, there was a young man named Edward Hyde, the third Earl of Clarendon, and he is going to be our Viscount Cornbury. He is off fighting in various wars for Great Britain, and he has a very impressive war record. Let me look at his war record here. He was the commander. He was appointed by King James II as commander of the Royal Dragoons, and he commanded that unit with distinction and great honor. So he was very loyal to James II. Now, when the Glorious Revolution came about, it wasn't just that William and Mary took the throne, but limitations were placed on the rule of the monarchy in Britain, with more power of the people being recognized through the House of Commons and more of a balance of power between the monarchy and the commons, so that the king would no longer be an absolute ruler. They feared this because of some of the things that James did as king to oppress people who disagreed with him and factions that were against his. So in trying to make sure that the people had more of a right of representation, the commons received a little bit more power, and William and Mary agreed to less power in the role of the monarchy. So in the meantime, our young Viscount Cornbury is off fighting and commanding the Royal Dragoons. But when William came to power, he was the first major commander of British forces to support William and Mary, turning on James II, who he'd been loyal to all that time and who had, of course, promoted him and favored him. So he was the first of the major commanders to support the Glorious Revolution, as it would be called. And this worked quite well for a while for our young Cornbury, until the argument of succession after William and Mary came up. And so if Mary was truly the heir and the ruler, and anything happened to her, there were those who argued that the successor ought to be her sister Anne, that Anne was the rightful heir to the throne. You could imagine, as far as William was concerned, was not so popular, the idea that if anything happened to his wife, he was no longer rightfully king, but her sister Anne should be queen. And as a result of that, Cornbury fell out of favor with King William, and he lost his military commission. He did have a minor seat in the Parliament, in the House of Commons, but he spent many years pretty broke and struggling to survive. But as a member of the Parliament, he did support William in all of his policies and his ideas, and paid off very well for him. In 1701, William III appointed Cornbury governor of New York. And off to New York came Cornbury, and his troubles began. Now, I should note here that William himself died before Cornbury arrived in New York to take on his role. He arrived in 1702, and Anne did become queen at that time. And Anne favored Cornbury very much because he had supported her right to succession. So he's going to have quite a lot of support of his cousin Anne. They were first cousins. During his time as governor of New York and also after his time as governor. So Cornbury arrives in 1702. What can I say? Right into the middle of the maelstrom that is always New York, New Jersey politics. And of course, it was boiling away when he arrived. And we could say Cornbury stepped right in and immediately made himself disliked by almost everyone, which unfortunately was often what happened to new governors who arrived from England. Not really understanding the politics of our colonies here, they often stepped right in and made enemies of all factions and wound up leaving. As a matter of fact, before the American Revolution, it became so difficult to govern New York that some gentlemen simply wouldn't accept the appointment. They wouldn't accept the commission, even though as governor of a colony, it was very lucrative. First of all, you got paid for it. And secondly, there was all kinds of bribes and corruption you could be involved in to make a little extra money. But governors increasingly said New York was not worth the trouble of trying to govern them. And one governor actually said that never had a piece of land so small caused so much trauma for the crown as the damn city of New York. So often we had no royal governor in place here in New York as it was so difficult to govern. But that will come a bit after Cornbury. So Cornbury is still one of these early governors who truly believes he can come to New York and make his mark on the colony and make it better and greater, and that he'll be remembered with greatness for all time. And believe me, it did not work out that way at all. So poor Cornbury arrives, and he gets here in 1702. The rector of Trinity Church went out and greeted him, and the Common Council sent a delegation, and there were parties and welcoming committees, and everything went quite well. And then Cornbury decided, though, that instead of living on the island of Manhattan or York Island, that he would build a home out on an island in the harbor called Naughton Island, which, as a result of his home being built there, then became known as the Governor's Island. And I believe in your time, simply Governor's Island. So that's Governor's Island gets its name. So Cornbury's out there on Governor's Island, and he's, governing New York and all of that. All that goes with that. And he quickly runs afoul of our political rivalries. One of the first giant mistakes Cornbury made was to try to make the Anglican Church the official state religion of New York. An incredibly bad idea. Bad, first of all, because there were already Huguenots and Quakers and Jews and Lutherans and Moravians. And did I say Presbyterians here? Presbyterians primarily from Scotland and Ireland. And this did not go over well at all. Even worse, in 1707, he had a Presbyterian pastor arrested. His name was Francis Makemie. He actually was the gentleman who established the Presbyterian congregations here in America. Well, Reverend Makemie was giving a service in a private home, and during that service, he baptized a baby. And Cornbury announced that that was against the rules of the Anglican Church and had him arrested and tried. As you could imagine, this was not well looked upon in New York. And to make it even worse, Cornbury lost the trial. The New York court agreed in Makemie's favor, and this began the establishment of the idea of free religious practice and freedom of association here in New York, which, as you know, will become very important when it's time to ratify our Constitution. So already in 1770, thanks to the blunderings of Governor Cornbury, we already began the ideas that those rights needed to be established in the law in order to secure them for us. So that is a huge mistake he makes. So that's number one with the Presbyterians. The next problem is he runs afoul of the political faction of Lewis Morris, who is the father of the Lewis Morris who signs the Declaration of Independence for New York, and his lawyer friends, James Alexander, William Smith, and the older Philip Livingston. Always a problem to go up against this particular Presbyterian faction. Well, when Lewis Morris, who at that time was in the Assembly, began speaking out about Cornbury's corruption, Cornbury simply removed him from the Assembly. This was a big problem. And Cornbury did this often. He believed in royal power over locally elected assemblies. And he even received a letter from his cousin, Queen Anne, supporting him in this idea. Now, this was a very bad move on their part, as you may know that the colonies already by 1700 were well used to governing themselves and being left alone. Of course, we had royal governors and customs officials, but our assemblies were elected by ourselves, and often our courts were appointed by ourselves. And so people did not take well to the idea that now this royal authority could rule over their local assemblies, overrule those assemblies, and remove people from them who did not agree. So this became a big issue for Cornbury as well, this idea of royal power over local assemblies. You know, it was never a good idea to try to tell the colonies what to do. We were very independent over here, very independent-minded. And, you know, I'm sure you do know that eventually the overbearing of the Parliament in trying to force us to behave their way will cause us to become the United States of America. So a very early poor idea. It was also known that Cornbury accepted bribes. He didn't pay his debts. He went to merchants, ordered all sorts of expensive goods, and would never bother paying the bill. And if a merchant then, tried to demand payment from him, he would sue them instead for another purpose. What else do you? Persecuted other religions. Oh, embezzling funds. And he had this incredible land scam that was going on, where he would take land that belonged to the colony of New York and either give it to his friends or sell it to his friends and keep the proceeds for himself. And I think he did this with a large tract of land north of New York City, which was then named for him. Are you ready? Hyde Park. As he was, well, let me get his full name again, Edward Hyde. And that, of course, would become the Hyde Park that you know from the Roosevelt family. So that originally was one of his deals where he sold land to a friend who named it for him, which never belonged to him in the first place. So another one of Cornbury's little deals that was going on. He was accused of being a thief, stealing from other people's homes. Oh, and Lady Cornbury as well, as it was said in the town that if you invited Lady Cornbury to your home, that you should put away all of your valuables, any jewelry or silver or anything you had laying about that could be stuffed into her clothing, as you would find it missing when she left your home. So that was Lady Cornbury as well. And when Lady Cornbury died, by the way, she was buried under the steeple of Trinity Churchyard, which I believe she still remains there in your time. And one observer in New York, I have to read this to give you the direct quote because it's so wonderful, I don't want to misquote it, said that Cornbury was a moral profligate, sunk in corruption, and perhaps the worst governor Britain ever imposed on an American colony. It was also rumored that when the gentlemen wrote the Constitution, that their provision to impeach a president was based on Cornbury and the inability of New Yorkers to get rid of him in spite of his corruption. So there was some talk about that. Now, I know that the part of Cornbury you all really want to know about. And I'm just going to change my background here for you, is this part. Did Governor Cornbury truly conduct business on the part of the crown dressed in women's clothes? And this again might simply be a part of, who do you believe in New York? Which faction do you tend to side with, and whose stories are you willing to believe? Now, eyewitnesses say that when he arrived in 1702, he opened the first session of the New York Assembly dressed like Queen Anne. And when questioned of why he did it, he said, "What better way to represent my cousin, the Queen, than to be dressed as her?" And so we have that. This is claimed to be an eyewitness account from someone at the time. In 1708, Lewis Morris, the gentleman he removed from his position in the Assembly, who later went on to be Chief Justice of the Court of the Colony of New York, and you might remember him from the John Peter Zenger trial, as he once again got thrown out of his position by a corrupt governor, and that would be Governor Cosby later. So a long line of corrupt governors and problems like that. But in 1708, I found a letter in an archive that Mr. Morris wrote to the then New York Secretary of State. And I'll read from you the notes I took from that letter today. And he wrote to him and he said, "I must say something which perhaps nobody will think worth their while to tell. And that is his dressing publicly in women's clothes every day and putting a stop to all public business while he is pleasing himself with a peculiar but detestable maggot." What is he talking about? That he's dressed in women's clothes and pleasing himself with which detestable maggot? Is that a woman or a man he's speaking of? I don't have any idea, but very strong words. He goes on to call him a mean liar, a vulgar profligate, a frivolous spendthrift, an impudent cheat, a fraudulent bankrupt, and detestable bigot. So Mr. Morris made his views very clear on what he thought about Cornbury. Now, they referred to him in New York. Many people referred to him as His High Mightiness, and others claimed that he once reviewed the Queen's troops in women's clothes, and people said he frequented the tavern in women's clothes as well. And there seemed to be, many firsthand accounts of this, and he even attended his wife's funeral in 1706 in ladies' clothes. But now, as years go by, it seems that it becomes a little bit more difficult to decide whether the firsthand accounts really are eyewitness accounts, or if they're just accounts of somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who saw it happen. And whether or not the whole story was simply concocted by the Morris, Alexander, Smith, Livingston faction to discredit Cornbury. Now, the painting you see here is a very mysterious painting. It bears no signature, and it seems to represent Cornbury in women's clothes. But I think, if you look at the body, that seems to be quite a thin and petite body for a gentleman, don't you think? And that, maybe the portrait was a lady's portrait. I can find it, a lady's portrait, that Cornbury's head may have been added onto later, because, a good painter could obviously take someone's body and place a head on it. Maybe you have tools to do such things as this in your time as well, to add someone else's head to a portrait or picture of a different person and make it look as though it is the same person. So this portrait in your time is a part of the collection of the New York Historical Society, and it is titled only, a lady, an unknown lady. So they themselves don't say whether or not this truly is Edward Hyde, 3rd Viscount Lord Cornbury. So I don't know what to say. I mean, we certainly know that there were gentlemen in England at that time who did, prefer to wear women's clothes, and that there were clubs they attended in London where the gentlemen wore women's clothes. And we also know it was fashionable, even when I was a girl, for the gentlemen to play ladies' roles on stage. And that even during the Revolutionary War, it wasn't unusual to see British officers playing women's roles on stage and performing themselves as ladies. So maybe this isn't quite as terrible as some people make it out to be. Although, as we can see, Mr. Morris certainly thought it was detestable and disgusting. So I wonder now what all of you think about this story of Governor Lord Cornbury and this, lovely portrait, purportedly of him, which could simply just be a result of your typical New York City politics of the early 18th century. Thank you guys all so much for joining me, guys, very much. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Have a healthy and wonderful week. Thank you.